Richie, I think you're our second guest only in 2026, and we're absolutely delighted to have you. We're going to be talking about nutrition in the context of health and performance. And for us, what we want to put out into the world is information that people can really trust, that there's a high level of credibility about it. I know that's something that's really important to you as well. But before we get into it, Richie, you might do your own introduction and give us a little bit around your own backstory and where you're from.
Yeah, God, my own backstory. How far do we want to go back?
All the way back to
From
the beginning.
Waterford. All right, okay. Born on a dairy farm in Waterford, raised on the finest of milk. No, I suppose I got into nutrition when I was younger. I used to be overweight. A lot of people get into nutrition for similar reasons, often for selfish reasons. They want to do something with their own health. So got into that. I studied at UCC, did biological sciences, not nutrition related, because back in the day, if you said you were doing nutrition, basically my parents said, "Sure, there's no careers in that. There's no money in that," and I listened to them. But a few years later, then I went off and I did a master's in nutrition because I love it. It's something that, like, obviously you can apply it to yourself. I find the topic absolutely fascinating. I'm always happy to learn more about it. So went did the masters in nutrition, and then I started working as a consultant nutritionist, and then I just realized I still love this, want to do more, so I went off and did a PhD in Liverpool, where I'm still now, because once I graduated, then I started working as a lecturer here at Liverpool John Moores University, and yeah, so I'm a registered nutritionist now, lecturer in nutrition and exercise science, and do research then related to nutrition and exercise as well. So that's me.
Richie, we talk a lot about the influence of our experiences and our environment on who we are and how we practice and our interests. And you very naturally brought in Ireland, farming, growing up on a dairy farm. What does that represent for you?
So it's an interesting one. This is weird. I love living in the city, but God, I love getting back home to Ireland now whatever chance I get. And I do have it in my head that I'll end up back in Ireland, and I do have it in my head that I'll end up with my own little piece of land as well. How realistic that is, I don't know. When it comes to a nutrition perspective, I've been around food production, I suppose, my entire life. You can say it was just milk, but that's probably formed a lot of who I am. I couldn't say how much so, which is odd because I don't drink milk actually, which is very strange because I just don't like the taste of it all. But I still consume a huge amount of dairy other ways. And then the weird thing now is, like, I don't eat a huge amount of meat. And that's kind of like part of just some of my nutritional principles and stuff like that as well. I will say one thing: growing up in on a farm in Ireland, you realize, like, farmers don't have the best of diets at all, and yeah, that has led to some health issues with some members of my family. We might chat about that a bit later, but that definitely had an impact on me as well.
Is there anything that you think in terms of that deep root? I mean, I'm fascinated around psychology and behavior. Is there anything that you, and not to make this too deep too soon, but from your experiences on a farm and the production of milk, is there anything that influenced, like, and I'm not being funny, but like being exposed to too much milk that influenced your taste on milk, or do you think it's just
I
something more primitive than that?
No, I'd say just having too much of it. As a child, and I just, like, I'm not into, I can't do it at all. I went through a phase a few years back where I was trying to drink more milk to gain some weight, and God, I used to down a pint, and it was one of the hardest things I ever had to do.
So then, I suppose if we were to talk a little bit more about how your own interests have translated into science, and that journey for you in becoming more specific about topics, and we'll get to some of the things, and I know a little bit later on around misinformation and the information that you think needs to get out into the world, and some of the conversations that you've had or that you have on a regular basis with your students. But talk to us a little bit about your academic journey.
Um, yeah, so if we start with biological sciences, the reason I did biological sciences is because I couldn't do nutrition. I had actually I'd planned on doing medicine. I'd always had this idea that I was going to get into some sort of like healthcare. I wanted to do medicine. Changed my mind last minute. I don't know, does Ireland still have the CAO? So I changed my mind and I decided I'm not going to do that. And then I'm just going to do general science and we'll see where we go from there. Did general science. And I enjoyed it. Like I'm an absolute nerd. Like no doubt about it. Love every aspect of science that I could do and learn about. Um, and I took a major break then after doing my degree. So I went off and I traveled for a few years. I um, lived in Japan for a few years. I lived in Colombia for a few years then. But like at the back of everything was like my interest in nutrition because it's something that you're applying every single day with what you eat and you know what you put into your body. And I just got to a point. It's like I love this so much. I need to do some. I need to learn more about it formally and just get into this because you know it's not something that I'm going to ever get away from. So I did went on and I did my master's then in Barcelona, and that was very heavily focused on Mediterranean diet. Like there was, I say they brainwash people about the Mediterranean diet there to a certain extent, and they do. But I was really lucky because I got to work with some of the, you know, the lead researchers on the PREDIMED study, which is a massive Mediterranean diet study, and that had a massive impact on kind of some of my philosophy around nutrition and actually nutrition science as well. And then, like I said, I worked as a consultant for a few years, and then I wanted to get back into formal education around nutrition, so I was going to be a PhD, and I was just very lucky. I saw this ad for a PhD, and it was Mediterranean diet, and it was heart disease, which is something I was very interested in because the PREDIMED study was all about heart disease. And it was about muscle mass as well as sarcopenia, muscle loss as people age. So all these three things combined together, and I was just like, Jesus, this is for me. And I remember saying it to my partner at the time, I need to get this PhD. And I was very lucky that I did and I got accepted to it. And then from there, that kind of really started like my let's say my research path and my career path from there on. So it's very much been focused on. I say Mediterranean diet. I prefer to say Mediterranean style diet because you know not everybody's going to be eating pizza and pasta and all that crack. But then you know high protein diets, resistance exercise, how that affects your heart health, how that affects your cardiometabolic health, um, and then everything else that has become associated with it. And one thing that I didn't expect is like the psychology of nutrition because you know you can give people the best nutrition advice in the world, but if you can't get them to actually follow it, you're not doing them any favors.
How that type of thinking is where I suppose we have a lot of our conversations around from the practical side and where you can look at the research and you can look at all the outcomes and then to try and relay that back to someone and help them to make change. How has your interest shifted in how you look at research and evidence from that?
Uh, I'd say definitely. So if I go back to my own PhD, what we were doing was we were putting people who were in cardiac rehab, so they've all had a heart attack. We were putting them onto a Mediterranean style diet, and we were getting them to do resistance exercise. And once the study was done, and I was looking at all the data, one thing that I realized is like not a lot of people were following the instructions as well as we would like them to. And one big thing I said is like we need to figure out ways to get people to do this better. So now I'm very lucky. I've got my own PhD students now, and one of them is doing a project related to mine. It's kind of like the kind of next step. And what they're doing is, again, similar protocol, Mediterranean diet, resistance exercise, older population. But what they're doing is focusing on how are we going to get them to stick to the diet. So what we're using is digital apps, and we're developing an app that gives them these little nudges every day around their food, and just ask them like, have you had certain things, like have you had a portion of fruit, have you had, whatever, to try and encourage them to do that. And then similar with the exercise as well. So it's definitely something that we're trying to focus on more now, like how can we get people to actually do what we'd like them to do.
Has it changed your relationship with evidence? Like when you can see it from that up close and in the weeds in such great detail, to then maybe hear some claims from social media and the outside world and how loosely that evidence is held.
um Yeah, I will say now, like I I understand more and more how difficult actually doing research is. So when I'm doing a research study, like you get into the nitty gritty of what makes a good research study and the difficulties that a researcher will have when they come, to actually doing it. So like I can look at a study and say, right, I can understand why they didn't do this, or I can ask myself the question, why didn't they do this, or why was this left out? And then when people are talking about research online, like people will make claims, pro or in favor of or against a certain piece of research, like, and I think the biggest thing that has come out of it is now is like I understand just how difficult it is for the general public to talk about and interpret research papers, because people love to do it online now. They'll pick up a study and say, look, this study says this, and then I'll be like, uh, not exactly, like the abstract might say something, but if you actually look into the paper, it's not, that's not what they're doing, so I suppose I do have that, I guess.
How do you manage to hold a position in in the way that you communicate that acknowledges that how challenging it is, but you don't lose people because you're just disagreeing with it? Because that's something that, I mean, I personally, I find very challenging, where there's a certain tone and there's a certain level of defensiveness that you can't have. Like it feeds into it. Very like, I know you're interested as well in the space of, the carnivore diet, and why, I know that's another area of interest. Why, what draws people to that? But I had a very interesting incident recently where I put up something about bread. I put up an article about bread, and there was a question underneath it. This actually drove one of our recent chats. But someone commented below about my integrity and credibility, and you pick it up. Now, I knew exactly what I was doing in responding to the question about it, where I read out the comment. But what I didn't know was that this particular person had a history of commenting and undermining the information. So what happened here is a very long-winded question for you. But what happened was, I actually inadvertently was actually creating attention for this person because of my own reaction. So there's a real challenge in holding the right ground or tone or position with all of this.
Daniel, if I had a proper answer to you, I'd give it to you. But I am trying to figure this social media stuff out every single day. And it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. I know the interaction that you're talking about. That particular individual has been contrarian on some of my own posts as well.
Right.
He's got a little bit of a reputation amongst some other colleagues in the field as well, and you figure out fairly quickly whether these people are there to ask questions and learn genuinely, or if they're there to be contrarian and just promote their own point. And this is something that it took me a while to come to terms with, but I finally accepted it. And again, some friends in the industry on social media who have much bigger accounts and much wider reach than me, I asked them, how do you deal with this? And they just said, well, you don't not to block them, but there's another thing that you can do on Instagram, for example, where you kind of you silence them and their comments don't appear. They don't appear in your feed or your notifications. So it's like they're shouting into the ether, and wasting their own voice. And like, I don't like doing that because some people can say, oh, like you're trying to silence other opinions. I'm not. I'm trying to silence gobshites that are stealing my time. And it's a really tough one because I I work in education and I want to encourage people to learn. So my tone is very, very much trying to be encouraging. But I also know that my tone changes sometimes. Like I've got a post that'll be coming out either today or tomorrow, and I have concerns. Is my tone a little bit too smarmy? Because I don't want to come across as that. But then sometimes you have to be like you have to take a stance on certain things, and yeah, it changes every day. My opinion changes on it every day. Sometimes I think I've done well. Sometimes I think yeah, could have definitely said that better. Yeah.
It's an interesting one. I block people all the time.
All right. Okay.
So I think that if you made a point there where are people there to have a conversation, a reasonable conversation, ask questions, that's absolutely fine. And different opinions are absolutely fine. But if somebody is just trying to drive their own agenda, then I'm not going to add any oxygen. And I'm certainly not going to allow my platform to be used for that purpose. So it's very clear. There's a very clear line in my head, and I don't. It doesn't cost me a thought. But I think that the conversation around the tone is such an interesting one because you have such great information to share with the world, and you are, we talk about your interest. You've dedicated your life to your subject, so there's a level of work that goes so far beyond just opinion, and what we need is to try and elevate well researched perspectives. And that's like even why we having this conversation today. You mentioned before we came on about some of the conversations that you have with your students and their perspectives. Tell us a bit about that. And you also said something that I found really fascinating, in that a student can be quite fixed in their outlook or an opinion on that. And you think about student fixed, it's quite a mix at such a young age to have be a student and having a fixed outlook.
Yeah. Do you know what? I think to kind of to to help summarize my how I feel about it, there was one very, very specific interaction that happened a few months ago, and it was with a student who she wasn't in any of my. She was on one course. I taught a couple of lectures to related to nutrition, but she wasn't in my specific nutrition course. She will be next year. But she started talking to me. I was at an event where we were kind of promoting our courses, our modules for the following year for electives, and we got talking about nutrition, and she just mentioned that she disagreed with something that she had heard that I said from one of my other students. And I said, oh, okay, what's that? And we started talking about a lot of topics. I ended up speaking with this girl for 45 minutes. And actually, I had a colleague who was sitting beside me, and he had kind of he'd overheard the whole thing as we'd gone through it, and he goes, "It's like, how did you not lose your temper with that?" And I was like, I have no idea either. But basically, she had some very, very fixed opinions on nutrition topics, and I will say this. Nutrition is a very personal thing, and I bring this up in lectures all the time. Nutrition is very personal. Every single person, we eat every day, unless you're doing something strange. We eat every day, usually multiple times a day, and people, their diets, especially if it's a diet that they have chosen to follow, it becomes part of their identity. And when your diet becomes part of your identity, you will do everything you can to defend that diet against anybody who might say anything against it. And we spoke about so many different things, but one of the big ones was we were speaking about seed oils. Okay. And she was like, seed oils are terrible for you. And I approached her with, okay, do you know that to be true? And these are two questions that I ask my students a lot. And I say, Do you know that to be true? That's the first question. And then they have to think about it and they go, right, they'll think about it and either they'll say yes or no. Okay. And then if no, it's fine. But if they say yes, my next question is, how do you know that to be true? And then they have to think, it's like, where have they heard that? And the vast majority of them have heard something on social media. They've heard it on, or they've heard it on a blog, they've heard it on TikTok, they've heard it on Instagram. And I'm like, right, do you know? So you've heard somebody else say that. Have you read any of the papers on it? And then it's almost always a no. And so I started speaking to her about it, and I started speaking about like mechanistic studies, and I started speaking about outcome studies. And I kept asking her questions and probing and probing and probing and probing. And at one point, I remember I had asked so many questions and she wasn't able to reply to any of them. I could see her holding her hands down by her side and her fists were shaking because she had nothing to answer. And it wasn't my goal at all to get her that worked up, but she got very, very worked up about it because her opinion was so fixed and because I was kind of very, very logically dismantling her argument. So yeah, students can absolutely have fixed opinions, and those fixed opinions are very, very much influenced by what students are exposed to. And students are exposed to, like everybody else these days, social media. And I don't know if I can say this word here, social media is an absolute shit show. I did a presentation on Monday to Heart UK. They're a charity that deal with heart health. And I was just going through slide after slide of study done on social media talking about how much of it is accurate, how much is inaccurate, how inaccurate and kind of inflammatory information is much more likely to spread and get shares and likes and get more engagement. And social media platforms want engagement, so they're going to spread that misinformation. And we're living in an age where misinformation is the norm, and I feel that it's almost an obligation now to try with my tiny little platform to kind of fight that misinformation and to do it with my students as well in the course I teach.
Let's not belittle your platform and let's amplify your platform. I want Gemma to take up a question and come back to the social media part. But what I want to ask about is the argument around seed oils. So for those, because that is something I'm fascinated by. I didn't fall into any traps as a young student or as a young person interested in sport and health, but I definitely fell into as the earlier research around low fat and avoiding fat being something that we should adhere to. This is, we're going back 20 years now. But can we explain to people who are listening, because I know I'm going to have a large number of our audience that might be interested in the seed oil discussion. What is a seed oil and what are the arguments against seed oils?
Sure. So seed oil, very, very basically, is the oil extracted from seeds of a number of different plants. And the most common ones that we have are things like sunflower seeds. Rapeseed oil is hugely popular, especially in Ireland, because it's something that we can grow and produce ourselves. Soybean oil. So there's lots and lots of different plants that we can get seed oils from. And they all tend to be very, very high in a particular fatty acid called linoleic acid, which is an omega-6 fatty acid. And people will have heard of omega-6s and omega-3s. Omega-6s and omega-3s, they're essential fatty acids. The argument against them is that omega-6 fatty acids and what we call polyunsaturated fatty acids, so these fatty acids that have unsaturated bonds, which are different from saturated fatty acids, which we mostly get from meat and dairy or coconut oil, because they've got these double bonds, they're more likely to react to oxygen. They're more likely to oxidize, and they're more likely to experience other reactions, and they're more likely to be sensitive to heat and heating, for example. So from a mechanistic perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Like, you think, all right, so they've got these unsaturated bonds, they're more likely to oxidize. Oxidizing sounds not so good. And then the big thing is that people will say that if you consume them, they are inflammatory. They promote inflammation in the body. And we also have studies where, they have used certain seed oils, and they can relate these seed oils to an inflammatory response. Because, so for example, that linoleic acid I mentioned, that can get converted in the body into arachidonic acid, which is another longer fatty acid. And we know that arachidonic acid is involved in these inflammatory responses in the body. It's also involved in some anti-inflammatory responses in the body as well. So this is a classic thing. People think one leads to the other, leads to the other. The problem is that doesn't happen necessarily in the body. We have a huge amount of research that shows that if you feed people lots of linoleic acid, you don't see an increase in inflammation. If you look at population studies and you look at the amount of linoleic acid, or these seed oils that people consume, you don't see an increase in inflammation. And if anything, you actually see a decrease in inflammation in some people. And what you also see is you see a decrease in chronic diseases like diabetes, heart disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, things like that. So these seed oils are beneficial, but there is a big caveat. And the caveat is also where a lot of the confusion comes in, because seed oils are cheap. And because seed oils are cheap, they're used very, very widely in the food industry for producing cheap, ultra-processed foods. So if you think about your crisps are fried in seed oils, your donuts are fried in seed oils, all of your commercial pastries are made with seed oils. They're in your Nutella, everything. They're absolutely everywhere. And what happens then is that, you can say, all right, people who are eating all of these seed oils because they're in everything. Yeah, people are eating all of these seed oils in all of these ultra processed foods. But the problem is people are eating too many ultra processed foods in general. I don't know what the numbers are like in Ireland at the moment. In the UK, it's about 56% of the diet is ultra processed foods. 56% of the calories that people consume are coming from ultra processed foods on average. And that's absolutely insane. It's insanity. And like I'm one of those people who I will gladly say it's not ultra processed foods. It's the fact that people are eating so many ultra processed foods and they're not getting all of the other good things that they should be getting into their diet. They're not getting fruits, they're not getting vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds and all that. So there's confusion there, and it's very, very difficult for the general public to untie that gigantic knot of confusion that you get from it.
Brilliant explanation. Really, really good. We know what part we'll be clipping up, Gemma. I will let you come in here after I ask one more question. I think I asked you a question around tone. I think what you described in the most recent stat is my biggest challenge. And what I mean by that is the proportion of processed foods is too high. We need to educate people around that number and that percentage being too high and the implications of it. Processed foods in the right proportion, in smaller proportions, are very well tolerated. There is such a challenge in communicating that message.
I fully agree. And I do a 2-hour lecture on ultra processed foods with my students, and it still takes me that much time to get into it. But there's a couple of different things that I do to explain this to people. One of them is I talk about a classic Kevin Hall study from a few years back, where they basically fed people a load of unprocessed foods and ultra processed foods, and basically what happened was when you feed people ultra processed foods is they overconsume. They overconsume calories, they gain weight. And that's what's happening. The ultra processed foods are so easy to overconsume. They're low in protein, they're low in fiber, they're very, very energy dense, and they're absolutely delicious. And you'll hear some people who say ultra processed foods are disgusting. No, they're not. People love them. Okay. And then the last one is they're everywhere and they're cheap. And you've got that, it's just a perfect storm. So people are able to overeat ultra processed foods, no problem at all. When was the last time you made yourself feel sick eating apples? It's like, it's not the easiest thing in the world. So that I go through that study and I explain that to my students in a fair bit of detail. But the thing that I do at the end is I open the screen, I'll have I'll have two diets. So one diet will be an unprocessed diet. So you'll see loads of fruits and vegetables, and you'll see like some dairy products and some meat, eggs, and things like this. And I'll say this is your whole food diet. And I'll ask the students, raise your hands. Who thinks this is a healthy diet? Virtually everybody will raise their hands. On the other side of the screen, I have basically a picture that is nothing but processed foods. There's donuts and sweets and like sugary drinks and pastries and all this. And I say, who thinks this is a healthy diet? Nobody. Okay. And then gradually what I'll do is I'll introduce a new image on top of each one. So onto the ultra processed diet over here, I'll put up I'll add a picture of broccoli. And I'll say, right, I'll put some broccoli into this. Is this a healthy diet? Nobody says so. On this one over here, I'll put a chocolate bar. Is this healthy diet? Is this now an unhealthy diet? Nobody. And I'll keep doing this gradually, right? Just for a few. And nobody will say that this is now has become an unhealthy diet because there's a couple of little ultra processed foods in there. And nobody will say that this is a healthy diet because you put like a couple of pieces of fruit into it. And I ask the question: at what point does one become unhealthy or not unhealthy? And I don't want an answer to that. I just want them to think about it. And that concept we need to get across to the public. And I've been meaning to do a flipping post on it on Instagram for a long time. But I think that that's a useful way of thinking about it and looking at it. Is you can have a very, very healthy diet and you can have some ultra processed foods in there and it's still a very, very healthy diet. It's the overall diet that matters.
I'm nodding along here like bobblehead Ray. I haven't stopped. Here we go.
These opinions and these like the sea oils, the ultra processed foods, that is and I believe always going to be the case, that there's going to be something new that comes along, and that's what gets attention, usually based from someone smart coming onto a big podcast or putting it out there in social media that has a huge influence. I believe we have a very reasonable audience. Our clients, I'm thinking of the people that we work with, who can still easily fall into the traps of these big claims. What, when you talk about useful ways to approach these types of discussions, or a helpful way for people to approach social media with that inquisitive mindset or critical thinking, is there any other, like, I think that's a brilliant example to be able to sit in front of students and get them to think in that way themselves. Is there any other useful approaches or insights that you could help to share with our audience and how they might show up in social media with a different lens?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and I think one of the easiest ways to kind of help people kind of identify problematic, let's say, information online is think about that. Is this a black and white message? Okay, so has somebody come online and just said this is good, this is bad, simple as. And the reason for that is you'll find that a lot of these people putting out misinformation online use black and white messaging. Okay, so they will give you one point and they will say this is the case. That's all you need to know. You get no context. There's no gray area in between. There's no, there's no further explanation. And social media loves that. And the general public loves that. And you can't blame the general public for loving that, because learning about anything new is hard. Like learning about nutrition is so bloody hard. So if somebody is going to give you this really, really hot take that's super easy, you're going to be like, oh, that's brilliant. Okay, I'll just learn that. Ultra processed foods, terrible. Seed oils, absolutely awful. Don't use those. Okay, Grant, I understand now. But it's not that easy. And I think, just looking at the way people are giving this messaging, are they giving you any context? If they're not, that's a bit of a one to just step back and say, right, how do I know this to be true? Is it really that easy?
It's hard, even for practitioners to be able to keep up with some of the new products, some of the new supplements, to have the expectation that there should be that knowledge, and to be able to have that conversation is difficult.
One thing I'd love to be able to say, like, look at somebody's credentials and say, like, who's giving you this information? But like, I see too many people who are, dietitians or nutritionists online, like actual registered nutritionists. And I'm like, how are you putting out that information? Like how do you think that's to be that is the case? So like, qualifications don't really do it for me. I will say, just because somebody's a bloody doctor does not mean they know anything about nutrition. Now there are some absolutely who do, and generally they're doctors who have actually done some sort of a nutrition education as part of their medical degree. But they're few and far between. So like, but like everybody wants to trust a doctor when it comes to health and nutrition. And I've had too many occasions online where people will say, "You're not a real doctor. I'm not going to listen to you." And I'm like, right, I can't do anything with that. Can't help you there.
I'm going to maybe put you in a very challenging position now, Richie, and let's see how you would help answer, but also maybe help me navigate this one. And normally I bring these to the team. We work with a lot of developing athletes. We work with a lot of experienced athletes, and the relationship people with that have with food is such a big one. And we will see a lot of maybe fixed thinking in their own beliefs around even how they eat being wrong. But there's no evidence for that either. Do you know what I mean? And then they will see things, or they will hear other athletes talk about their behaviors, and then they'll think, well, that actually supports my idea about myself. I do overeat. I do eat too much sugar. How do you navigate that? Do you know what I mean? Do you know what I'm asking?
Can you give me a bit of a concrete example on that, just to?
Do you know what I'm talking about, Gemma?
I can think of the example of where that's come from.
Can you help me give that context?
I think it's maybe coming from the ideal version that they have in their heads of what they believe to be good, and then that can often make them, when they see something different to what they're doing, it just drifts them away from what act, not just the evidence, but their personal beliefs. I know the example that's been referred to there is an influential athlete can have their approach and their influence because of where they've got to, can just be the evidence that someone else needs to change their dietary approaches. Because, well, if they got there and this is what they do, maybe I should do that as well, because that's going to help
Mhm.
me to get to where I want to go. Versus like actually having
But
concrete evidence
that's
themselves.
not the right, that's not what they need to hear, but
Yeah.
that's what they lean towards.
Yeah, I think especially when you're working with athletes and people who are driven, they're willing to do absolutely anything to get to where they want to go, and because of that, people who are driven are often incredibly self-critical. Okay, so they will look at themselves and look at their habits, and they'll be like, this is why I'm not where I need to be. Or they'll start questioning, why am I not where I want to be? What's going on here? And it's very, very easy then to look at, like, like superstars, and just say, this is what this guy is doing. That's what I need to do. And that may not be the case. Like there was that American football player. You'll have to forgive me because I cannot remember his name. He was married to Giselle at one point. Very, very famous American football player, but he was also very, very famous for having some very strange dietary habits.
Not
And
Tom
like
Brady. Tom
Tom
Brady.
Brady.
Oh yeah,
There you
yeah.
go. Okay, right. So Tom Brady, you can tell how good I am at sports personalities. Um, but he had some very, very strange dietary habits, and I would look at him and I would say, I would never put an athlete that I work with on any kind of diet related to him. But Tom Brady was an absolute flipping legend, superstar, played for years, and like I don't think, like, obviously the fact that he cared about his nutrition was a big important part, but I don't think people realize just how much genetics comes into the the capabilities of an athlete, but also the longevity of an athlete as well. Yes, your training comes in. Yes, your nutrition comes in. But like, Tom Brady would probably have been playing for a very, very long time, regardless of some of the intricacies of his diet. But people don't think about that. People just think Tom Brady eats this. I'm going to do that,
Well, it's
or he
also
needs to
about
do
the
that.
accuracy of what he puts out. He is a personalized chef. And who knows? Like, you put out the best version that you believe in, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the truth. So it's a product. He's commercializing what he's done, and this is the Tom TB12 way. It's we could go into multiple different examples of it, but I think that's good context. And I guess just to bring it home, I think it's something that we work really hard to do within our work is, what's your context? What's your framework? What do you need to focus on to bring you from the point that you're at now with your behaviors and your knowledge and your skills to the next point? And that's all that's relevant based on your goal and what you're trying to do.
And I think it comes back to this concept of optimization. Everybody's talking about flipping optimization now, and I absolutely hate the word, because there is no optimum diet. If there is an optimum diet, there is an optimum diet that works for this individual, for this specific goal, at this specific time in their life, which means it's a very, very fluid concept. And there's no optimum that like people are trying to pursue.
Yeah, I think was it Brian Johnson had this. He put out a list recently of things that actually are what he was saying are actually leading to the longevity approach that he's talking about. But of all the things that he's done, the list is like sleep better, is the absolute basics. So he's gone through this whole years and years of doing these crazy things, and it's when you look at the actual list, it's yeah, it's
I think also with Brian Johnson, we're not going to know if anything he's done has actually worked for another 40 years or so. So
yeah, he's gonna live forever anyway. So
Richie, a huge thank you. I think, I don't know, Gemma, we probably need to book in another conversation with Richie. I know your time is very valuable, but I think there's probably an awful lot more we could get into. And I think that's the great thing about having conversations that are evidence based, but also operate in the real world. I think you do a brilliant job of that. And we're very, very grateful for you to come on and share your insights. And the examples are so useful. I think we could take something out of that blended version, Gemma, for the work that we do as well to help our athletes understand that context. It's a really great example that you use with your students. Thank you, Richie.
been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for the chat.